Everyone, it's Emily Fox. Today's video is going to be all about beginner-friendly fantasy books, which I feel like fantasy can be quite intimidating if you haven't been reading a lot of them, or if you took a break and then you're trying to get back into it, or you want to go from like YA books to adult books. It can be a lot, so I thought it would be fun to do very beginner-friendly options. Most of these are standalones, which I think helps a lot. I've done a lot of similar videos for sci-fi, so I will link that down below if you're interested. The first couple ones are low fantasy, specifically. Basically, it's our world, just, magic is a thing. High fantasy can be a lot also. You start a book and then there's a lot of words. They don't mean anything to you. They're confusing. They're like 1,000 pages and it's like a 10-book series. It can be a lot. I get it. So we're starting with the most beginner-friendly ones, a little bit based on like if you usually read that genre, I've tried this one. And then we're going more and more into a little bit more intense, but still very beginner-friendly and like a standalone. So you don't have to commit to 10 books. You don't have to be like, oh, you have to read the first 10 for it to get better. None of that. None of that. Okay, so the first one is if you are someone that reads more contemporary, more romance, and you want to get into fantasy, I feel like this one is very, very beginner friendly. This is the Very Secret Society of Irregular Witches. So you're following a character who is an orphan. She has been feeling quite lost in her life, and she's quite isolated and trying to, find herself, but she's a witch. And she finds this job in this manor, this remote house where she will be teaching young children. And it's definitely a finding friendships, but like found family vibes. And there is a romance, which, unpopular opinion, I feel like they had a fight at one point, spoiler free. I can spoil it in the comment section. But I feel like it went too far, so I wasn't really rooting for them that much. I'm just going to say it. But they were cute otherwise. But there's just that one fight that I tend to be quite harsh with romance, so don't mind that. Everything else I really, really enjoyed. I would call this a cozy fantasy, which I feel like is very beginner friendly because, again, it's not like huge battles or anything like that. It's very accessible and it's not super big. I feel like during the summer this is just perfect. So if you're looking for a very beginner romance fantasy, I would recommend trying this one. It was cute. I liked it. And again, I'm not huge on romance, so. The next one, also a little bit of a romance, but it's definitely more of a cozy fantasy. This is technically a duology. There's a prequel, but you can 100% read it just as a standalone. Legends and Lattes, if you've been anywhere on Booktube, you've definitely seen that book. Everyone has been reading it and raving about it, myself included. This was just a pleasant surprise for me. I wasn't someone that read cozy books that much until then. Now I've been trying more and more. But yes, this was fun. You're following this orc who has been a mercenary her whole adult life so far, even as a child, which you get in the prequel, she wanted to become one, just spend her whole life fighting. But at this point, she's tired of it. She wants a break. She wants to retire. So she takes all the money that she has and she buys this shop in a small town and decides to open a coffee shop. Coffee is just not a thing apparently there. And you're just following her, repairing the place, hiring people, trying to convince people to become customers. And once again, definitely found family vibes, making friendships, trying to make it work. It's very much day-to-day, which I feel like is a lot less intimidating. That like big world, it's definitely centered around her like slice of life kind of content. And yeah, I really enjoyed it. There's the cook, which I don't remember their name, but I really like them too. And yeah, this was cute. So if you're looking for, once again, a very easy book to get into, this one is high fantasy technically because it is not in our world, but in a very easy, beginner-friendly way. Not the most unique recommendation, but definitely a good one to start with. The next one though. If you are someone that likes more like mystery, thriller, horror, and you want to get into fantasy, I feel like this one, people could debate that it's a bit sci-fi, but either way, this was a pleasant surprise for me, and I want more of an occasion to rave about it because this was so good. This is Into the Drowning Deep, and the premise definitely sounds more like horror thriller. You have the main character, her sister a couple years ago was part of this team. They were doing like fake documentary, like mockumentaries. Anyway, they were doing some about like, think unicorns, and one of them was about mermaids. And during that episode, while they were filming it, everyone on the boat got, and a few clips were released, but everyone was like, oh, it's fake. It was a couple years ago, so technology wasn't as advanced, blah, blah, blah. But she manages to convince the entertaining company to attempt it again. So this time they're prepared. They have people with their pew-pews, and they have cameras trying to, a whole team trying to figure out what happened and still trying to capture his mermaid on camera. Turns out the mermaids might still be hungry. That's all I'm gonna say. So you definitely get the horror and thriller vibes, but I ended up really more attached to the characters than I usually do in these kind of stories. I feel like the author was very good at writing good characters, but also like the bad ones, which you know the author is good when you actually hate the characters. So some of them, definitely hated them, but I was definitely really uncomfortable in moments. I definitely feel like the whole fantasy elements were well used. And again, if you're trying to get into fantasy and you're more into thriller horror, I think this is a good way to get into it because it is low fantasy. So it's our world just with possible mermaid. And it is, once again, a standalone, so it's a little bit thicker than the other ones. This one is just under 500 pages, and yes, it was great. I enjoyed it. Can't recommend it enough. And I do think it's very beginner friendly. So that was definitely the darker recommendation of this video. The next one, also a pleasant surprise for me. This was definitely outside of my comfort zone. This is Piranesi, and I read the first couple pages, put it down, and I almost never finished. If it weren't for the book club, I wouldn't have, because it's so confusing at first, but I promise it's literally just the first couple pages because the main character has no idea what's going on. They're having like memory issues, and that's why it's confusing. I just need to start with that because otherwise it might seem like it's too difficult to be beginner friendly, but afterwards I feel like this would be great for someone that reads more like literary fiction, dark academia, because you get the same lyrical writing style that I feel like is really common and that you might enjoy if that's your thing. So in this one, like I said, the main character is very confused. You don't know exactly what's going on. They seem to be in this big palace and just always lost, trying to day-to-day survive, and then more and more their brain starts working again. They're trying to piece things together, what happened, where they are, who they are, and I don't want to say anything else because it's not super big and a fairly quick read. It's 250 pages, but yes, definitely like it's fantasy, magical realism, dark academia, and I really enjoyed it. So if you're someone that really enjoys beautiful writing and not so much like strict magic system or anything, this would definitely be high fantasy-ish. Because again, you don't really know what's going on in the beginning, and I don't want to tell you anything else. So Piranesi, definitely a pleasant surprise for me. I really enjoy this. I feel like this has been getting a lot of hype, and it completely deserves that. So this is good. Okay, now we're definitely getting more into like the straight up fantasy. So the first one I wanted to recommend for someone that might read more young adult books and wants to become more of an adult reader, but you're intimidated, I would recommend Nettle and Bone, because this was kind of a retelling vibes, like think fairy tale-ish kind of vibes. The main character is a third-born princess, so really she had no big plans in her life. She was essentially becoming a nun, and unfortunately her older sister, who was married to the prince in a different kingdom, was found, and suspicion of, you know, the prince being the one responsible, or just straight up violence, domestic violence, and unfortunately her other sister is forced to go and basically replace her, and she decides to go and save her. So someone that is really not trained for any of this ends up going in on this adventure, and even though it sounds kind of dark, I feel like the tone of the book felt quite light. I actually personally enjoyed it as an audiobook also, would recommend it that way, and yeah, just kind of cozy, which I feel like, again, that description does not sound like it is, but I think it's the whole like retelling vibes that really made me enjoy this. So if you want to get more into high fantasy, but you don't want anything overly complicated, I think that this one, because it is very character driven and focus on these attaching characters, I think you would enjoy Nettle and Bone. So I would absolutely recommend this one. Another one that is about that same level of difficulty would be The Goblin Emperor. I actually had this on my shelf for like years and years and years and never picked it up until this year, and I really enjoyed it. I think a lot of you would also. It is, again, a standalone adult high fantasy. It's 450 pages-ish, but I would consider this also very beginner friendly because it is once again a slice of life. Your following character, he is the son of the emperor, but the second wife that never was liked, she unfortunately passed away, and he was pushed back away, basically completely isolated. But then the emperor dies, and his brothers, and he is forced to go and take his place. So you're following him knowing nothing about anything and trying to navigate political intrigues and just trying to figure out who's an ally, who's an enemy. Obviously not everyone is happy about him having the throne now, and just, continue following this story. And I really enjoyed it because the main character is super attaching. I was super invested in him. And the only thing that I would say that is a bit less beginner friendly is a few of the terms are more complicated. So that's why I like high fantasy. At court, basically, it's not the same way that we do. Like the names are more complicated, the titles. But again, it's a small portion of the book, and a few of the dialogues are in like Old English, and English is not my first language, but like that's the toughest part of the book, which is basically nothing. So I would highly recommend this book. I really, really enjoyed this. You're going to see me recommend this a lot more, especially if I do videos about Standalone, which I feel like this video kind of is. But if you enjoy slice of life and you want to get into fantasy, I think this would be a really good way of doing it. I feel like when the characters are attaching, you're more emotionally invested, and the fantasy background is not as intimidating. So I can't recommend this enough. So this is where we get more into complicated fantasy. I still think they're very beginner friendly. All three of them are like all-time favorites, so I can't help but recommend them. They're just a little bit more complicated. If like all the ones I've been mentioning are like, it's not fantasy enough for me, this is it. So the first one is the only strict series in this video, and it is Dark Materials. I have to put it on the screen because I let someone borrow it. It better come back in one piece. I have this actually gorgeous edition, which if you can find it, I can't recommend it enough. It's super pretty. But you might have seen the individual books growing up because I grew up reading them and they broke me as a kid. Because technically it's been marketed as a children's book, and I reread it as an adult, and I feel like you're following characters that are children, yes, but it's not really a children's book. I feel like a lot of it went way, way above my head. So in the first book, you're following Lyra, who has had quite a childhood. She was technically Dark Academia vibes in Oxford, and she was surrounded by scholars. So she's definitely really curious, very intelligent, and one of her friend was kidnapped. He disappears, and she goes on this big mission in the north trying to save him. So think giant talking bears, think big adventures, magic. We're going to keep that vague because it's happening more at the end of the book, but a lot is happening. Again, very much high fantasy, but in the best way possible. And I feel like because it was marketed often as a children's book, it makes it very accessible, but at the same time it doesn't read like a children's book. Like I said, the overall message of the series tends to be against organized religion. That's why there was a lot of controversy when it came out. People were like, oh, it's against, you know, God, blah, blah. It's against organized religion. There's definitely some messages that, once again, will go way above your head if you're reading it as a kid, but I wanted to include it in here because to me, I see it as an easy book because, again, I'm nostalgia, basically. But this was fantastic, and I feel like if you get invested in the story, I think this would be a great way to start reading fantasy. So that one is definitely like I just wanted to include it in here because why not? The next book actually won my #1 best book that I've read last year. Out of the 100-something books that I've read, this was my #1, and it is Blood Over Bright Haven. I'm including it in here also a little selfishly because I really love it. This was originally self-published, but it was picked up by a publisher. Do yourself a favor, pre-order it because it is absolutely worth the hype that I'm actually giving it, because it's not that well known yet. It will be, I guarantee you it will be. So adult standalone high fantasy. The first chapter, it's like the prologue, grips you instantly. I love when books do that. Again, if you're intimidated often by a genre, you want something that right away you're into. You don't want to have to wait halfway through the book to be into it. So first chapter, you're following the remnant of this tribe that are trying to make a run through this frozen lake to make it to safety. And a lot is happening. Magic is happening, just them as they're running. So it's really, really difficult emotionally because I cared about them instantly. And then first chapter actually begins. You're following this woman who spent her whole life so far studying, trying to make it to the, I think it's the High Magistracy. Think again, Dark Academia vibes a little bit. And she wants to do research surrounding magic. The thing is, no woman has ever been accepted in the last like 200 years. Every 10 years, they'll allow one woman to try and pass the test and they always fail. But she makes it. That's how it starts. And then eventually the stories converge. And again, unlikely friendship, I guess, allyship. I was, again, extremely emotionally invested. The author destroyed my poor little heart. That's what I'm going to say. But yes, I found that even though it appears that the world is going to be big and complicated because you're very much centered around these two characters, it doesn't make it as intimidating as other series, especially the ones that are like multiple books. So you get a satisfying ending or an actual ending because one book, and it will destroy you. You will love it. I love this book so much. I needed to mention it because you deserve this. Okay, do yourself a favor, pick it up, love it, cry with me, and you'll love fantasy after that. For the next one, I needed to include a Brandon Sanderson book because I feel like every time you see fantasy, you want to get into fantasy, you see specific authors, and some of them I don't think they're that worth it, but some of them are, and I do understand the hype behind Brandy Sandy. I agree, his books are fantastic. His adult fantasy books are fantastic. This is definitely high fantasy, and in my opinion, this is the best way to start reading his book. I know a lot of people say Mistborn, but Mistborn is a trilogy. I mean, there's more than that, but there's first trilogy, and they're all like 600-700 pages. I do feel like they have sometimes moments that are not as gripping, so it can be, I think it's too much to start fantasy. Start with this one. This is currently a standalone because eventually he wants to continue, but you can read it as it's standalone on its own right now. There's no big cliffhanger or anything. In this one, the magic system is really interesting because it is based on color. So like people that want to use the magic, they have to see color, take the colors. You'll understand once you read the book. And another trope that is in there that I found interesting is like the God walking among us. So you're following at one point of view is a god, and you realize things are not quite what you would expect to be. And there's also a talking sword, which I feel like that's such a classic trope in fantasy. So you get to experience all of these things, but mostly you get to experience Brandon Sanderson as an author, because one of the strengths is the Sanderson avalanche that people talk about, and it is the endings. Every time I'm fascinated because you can see all the pieces that seem random, like the religion, the political, the magic system, everything falls into place, and you're like, oh, everything was thought through, everything was planned, and now it makes sense. And every time, super impressive. So of course I needed to add this in here, even though it is once again high fantasy, a little bit more complicated than the first ones I mentioned. I do think this is still beginner friendly. It is available also for free on his website as a PDF. I know not everyone has access to books or English books, so you can do that instead. But yes, absolutely would recommend starting with this one. I did a whole video actually going through all the books that I've read by him, letting you know, but the answer is this one. You should start with this one. I think it's the best way to do that. So this is kind of my top 9. Realizing I didn't line, but my top 9 books that I would recommend starting with if you want to get into fantasy. You can definitely find at least one book in here that should intrigue you, something to get into. I will be continuing this. This is going to be a series, so this is definitely like a beginner friendly. I'll do a step over, which is probably going to be more like the last couple books that I've mentioned, and we'll keep going like that until we get to like expert level, which I might not be yet because I feel like I still want to read more. I would love to hear in the comment section other fantasy books, beginner friendly, that you would recommend. If I've tried them, I will also approve, and if I haven't tried them, I'll definitely pick those up. I hope you enjoyed this video. Thumbs up, subscribe. Like I said, I'll put the other videos I've mentioned in the description box. Actually, I could put some on the screen right now. So the beginner-friendly sci-fi, and then the Brandon Sanderson recommendation and review of all of his work. So I hope you enjoyed this video. I will see you in my next one. Bye.